Now, what's Photoshop without some special effects? Let's talk about Photoshop's filters. Now, I'll bet you a coffee that you've already messed around with Photoshop's filters a little bit, because that's usually where people head first, especially if they're new to Photoshop and maybe a friend or a family member or a coworker has shown them just a little bit. Usually filters is the first place they go, because that's where all the wacky, crazy stuff is. You know, taking a photograph and making it look like it was painted in watercolors, or taking a photograph and making it look like a photocopy or something like this, right? So let's have some fun here. What I'm going to do is go and open up the next sample file that we'll use here, and I'm going to use a sample file called Scientist2. Look for him inside the project files. This is a cartoon that I drew at the kitchen table one Saturday morning, and then of course colored him inside Photoshop. And let's use this guy as our example here. Now, most of the filters, they sort of break into two categories, or they sort of fall into two categories. Some filters are destructive. They're just crazy, fun, wacky, right? Like making this guy look like he's made out of chrome or molten lead or something like that, right? And then other filters are actually corrective. Like there's a filter called Unsharp Mask, which is used to help sharpen up photographs, right? So again, there's sort of two camps happening here. Further to that, most filters work in a similar way as well. Most of them have a very similar interface, and I'll show you this interface in just a second. And you know, some filters open up inside a massive dialog box called the filter gallery, while other filters open up inside their own dialog box, and I'll show you this as well. So to get you started here, I think what I'll do is I'll start you off on one of the more simple filters, although this is a filter that a lot of people use a lot of the time. He's called Add Noise, and this is a great way to add sort of a film grain look to a photo or to a mad scientist cartoon if you happen to have one kicking around. So I'm going to head to the filter menu up at the top here, and then I'm going to head down to noise, and then I'll choose add noise. Okay, great. Now, this is an example of a filter opening up inside his own dialog box, the Add Noise dialog box. A lot of common elements here. We have a preview checkbox. I can hold down Alt or Option and get my reset button showing up. We've seen this in a number of different Photoshop dialog boxes. And then, of course, down towards the bottom, settings. Now, in this main area here, you have your preview, which you can use to get an idea of what your cartoon or what your photograph is going to look like with the applied filter. But you know, if your preview checkbox is turned on, you may as well just look inside your document window. So this little preview window I usually just ignore. I don't even bother looking at it, really. I'm more looking over inside my document, to be honest. Now, as far as Add Noise is concerned, we have an amount slider, and very quickly things can get out of hand in terms of adding noise here. So you don't want to go too crazy. But again, it's all sort of up to you. You can kind of decide what you think looks good there. So I'm around 15, 16%. Below that, we have our distribution. We can go uniform or we can go Gaussian. It's entirely up to you. Just a different method for distributing the noise inside your image. And then my personal favorite is monochromatic. I can turn that on, and now I get black and white noise, or grayscale noise, if you will. And I'll drop this down a little bit more, maybe. So again, kind of a neat film grain effect there. Lots of fun. Anyway, go ahead and click on OK. Now, of course, this almost goes without saying, but the noise that I just added to my cartoon is permanent. It's a permanent change. So in just a little while, I'll show you how to work with filters in a non-destructive way. But before we get to that, I want to show you this thing called the filter gallery, and we'll do that next. Okay, let's check out this thing in Photoshop called the filter gallery. But you know, before going any further, I'm going to revert my mad scientist, my scientist2.psd file. So I'll just hit F12 on my keyboard to essentially remove that add noise filter that you and I had just added to this guy. And this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to head back to the filter menu. And by the way, as a quick aside, notice that the first menu item is the last filter that you and I chose. Just kind of a handy little thing to keep in mind. In any regard, I'm going to head down to Artistic, and then I'm going to choose Paint Daubs. Okay. Now, as soon as I do that, I'm brought into this massive dialog box. This is the filter gallery. And how the filter gallery works is we have our image preview here on the left-hand side. I have all of my available filters in this center column, and then over on the right hand side I have my settings, usually my sliders and numeric fields and drop down menus and things like this on the top right, and then in the bottom right we have an area that almost looks like layers, and I'll talk about that in just a second. So the idea here is I would come into the filter gallery and I would start off in the top right corner messing around with my settings, and again it's all really up to you, whatever you think looks good, right? So maybe myself, I'll reduce down my brush size. Maybe I'll bring this down to about 6, and maybe I'll drop down my sharpness down to about 10 or 11, something like this. Now, obviously, as I'm making my adjustments here over on the right, you can see the image preview on the far left is updating, right? Neat. It's pretty cool stuff. But what I can do now is I can go and add in additional filters. Check this out. Over in the bottom right corner, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this little icon here, a new effect layer. Go ahead and click on that guy. And now I have 2 instances of paint daubs. But I don't want 2 instances of paint daubs. I want watercolor on top of paint daubs. So I have the topmost layer effect selected here. And then over in the center column, I'm going to go and choose watercolor. Or, I could go through all these different options and go and find a different filter to actually apply in addition to paint daubs. So in other words, I can actually stack filters one on top of another. So I'm going to click on watercolor here. Now I have this watercolor effect, and I can come into the top right and start messing around. Brush detail, shadow intensity, texture, and so on. And what's really cool is I have tons of options here. I can go and add in more effects if I want. I can turn off paint daubs, or I could turn off watercolor, or I could go, watercolor, I don't know what I was thinking. Select that guy, hit the trash can down at the bottom, get rid of them, and then start all over again with a new layer effect. And then what the heck, maybe I would go into sketch and then say, for example, chalk and charcoal. I mean, you can really go bananas here, right? But don't forget, now that I'm done messing around with my filter and I'm done messing around with my filter gallery and I click on OK, this is a permanent change inside my photo, which of course you and I both know I am not for, right? So I want to show you now how to go about working with your filters and your effects in a non-destructive, fully editable way. Applying filters and effects in a non-destructive way, in a fully editable way inside Photoshop is definitely possible. But I think before we get to all that, we better revert this fella here. So once again, I'll just tap the F12 key on my keyboard. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take this guy and I'm going to convert him for something that's called smart filters. I think you're really going to like this. So what I'm going to do is, well, first of all, down inside the layers palette, I have the cartoon scientist layer selected. So it's not the white layer, simply the background layer there. It's the layer that actually holds the scientist. He's the guy that's selected. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to head up to the filter menu, and then I'm going to choose Convert for Smart Filters. Go ahead and choose that option. And then I get this warning here. I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. And now inside the layers palette, I get this icon here. Again, remember we saw this when we were working with smart objects, right? Again, so everything kind of ties together here. Now, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go and apply a filter. So I'm going to head back up to the filter menu, down to Artistic, and then I'll choose Film Grain. Now, you can choose whichever filter you like here. And in terms of your settings, you can really set up your filter however you want. You can increase the grain there if you want by dragging on that first slider, your highlight area, your intensity, whatever you want, right? As a matter of fact, you could even go and add in more filters down in the bottom right if you really want to. But I'm going to try and keep it sort of simple and straight up here for you. So that's all I'm going to do is just some simple changes there. I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. All right. Now have a look at your layers palette. There's my Mad Scientist cartoon layer, and there's my smart filters, and there's my film grain. So a week from now or a month from now, I might be looking at this going, I'm not sure that I'm really happy with this. Maybe I should take the film grain off. So I'll just disable the film grain by clicking on his eyeball inside the layers palette, and it takes me back to where I started. Or I could have the film grain turned on and I go, maybe I should adjust some of those settings. I'm going to click on the icon way over on the right-hand side of the layers palette. In fact, I'm going to double-click on him, really. And what that does, actually, is it brings me into the blending options for my film grain, which is kind of cool. So in other words, I could drop the opacity of the effect, which is kind of interesting, kind of cool. And again, if I have my preview turned on, I can see that effect happening there. But that's not exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to change the settings for the actual filter, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cancel out of this guy. You can mess with this if you want, but I'm going to cancel out of mine. And I'm going to double click instead right where it says film grain. The actual text there, film grain, brings me back into the filter gallery. I'm still inside my smart object here. So what I can do is come back in here, make any changes that I want to the settings that I've used. In fact, at this point, I could even add in additional filters if I wanted to. Let me throw in a couple of quick ideas here for you. Maybe some patchwork there, something like this, right? You can really do some cool things here. Maybe I'll go with something like that. Kind of looks like a sort of an 80s video game, doesn't it? I think that looks kind of cool. So I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. But again, all of this is non-destructive, right? At any time, I can turn off my filters and go all the way back to where I started. I've got to show you this amazing new feature inside Photoshop CS5 called Puppet Warp, and I think you're gonna really get a kick out of this guy. So let me explain here, just before I really get rolling here. What I did is I hit F12 one more time on our mad scientist to remove all of the filters and so on that you and I had applied. Now, you know, to get your Puppet Warp to work properly, what you need is an object isolated on its own layer. And you know, it doesn't have to be a cartoon. It doesn't have to be a cartoon mad scientist. It can be anything. It can be a car, it could be some vines, it could be some trees, whatever you want. And that's why we spent so much time talking about masking earlier on and creating perfect selections, because you want to be able to pull objects off their background. So once again, my mad scientist is isolated on his own layer. He's sitting all by himself on this layer 1. I'm going to make sure that layer 1 is selected there. And then to actually initiate this new feature called Puppet Warp, what I'm going to do is head up to the Edit menu and then down to Puppet Warp, I guess about halfway down. Perfect. Now, what we can do here is we can start adding pins onto our artwork, and we can actually start warping our image, warping our artwork. Now, you know, if you have a mesh over top of your image right now, you can always uncheck Show Mesh up on the options bar there. I usually turn mine off. I find it a little bit distracting there. And you can still use your Puppet Warp if you don't have a mesh, which is great. So here's what I'm going to do. This is literally like sticking push pins into your artwork. So I'm going to stick a push pin right through the top of this guy's head right there, just by single clicking there. And let's see, I'm going to stick one through his left eye, not to be morbid, but or the right side of our artwork anyway. And then through his ear there, I'm just really setting almost like anchor points inside the image. And I'm going to put one on his elbow, down towards the bottom left there, and then I'm going to put one right on the end of the needle, somewhere up here. Okay, great. Now for the fun part. Now that we've plotted out some points here, what I can start doing literally is dragging on these points to start warping my object, warping my artwork. So maybe I want to have his head sort of a little more, you know, skinny and kind of scrunched up, or maybe I want to, you know, kind of pull the top of his head in, something like this, or pull the right side of his head out a little bit more, something like that, which I think looks hilarious. I think that's awesome. Or I could, you know, grab his elbow and literally just have fun with this, right? And go crazy and see what kind of an effect you can pull off. It's lots and lots of fun here. And what's great is while I'm messing around here, this entire object that sits all by himself on his own layer is completely editable, and it's a whole lot of fun to sort of mess around with this. I'll grab the end of his needle here, and I'll kind of pull it in. I'll kind of bend the end of the needle here. And you know, if I want more anchor points, I can just continue clicking on my artwork, something like this. There we go, maybe something like that, or I could add more down, you know, down on his body there, or at the bottom of his coat. Again, really, whatever it is that I want here. It's a lot of fun, and I'm sure you're going to spend hours having fun messing around with your artwork. Now, you know, once you've had fun and you've made a royal mess out of your art, all you need to do now is just go back to your Move tool inside your toolbox, grab that fella, and you're going to get a warning here. Hey, do you want to apply this Puppet Warp? Now, if you say don't apply, you're going to lose all your changes. But if I click apply, then Photoshop actually applies the puppet warp, applies my changes to my mad scientist cartoon.